Welcome to the virtual study of the Constitution and the Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to another week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. Today is Monday, the 9th day of January in the year 2017. And we got a taste of winter this, as the whole nation did, of course. When they said that there were places in South Carolina that got 8 or 9 inches of snow, I kind of had a feeling that the whole nation pretty well got a taste of it this weekend. But it's warming up out there, and the sun is shining, and I guess probably it won't be long before the snow melts. We're looking at the mid 40s and low 50s at the end of the week here in Appalachia. So I'm guessing that our taste of very cold winter, we were 3 degrees, I believe, last night. But it was brief, but it's tough. It was really tough, and I'm kind of looking forward. I guess I don't take it as mightily as I did when I was younger. But anyway, be that as it may, welcome to another week of programming here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you. I do invite you to participate in our program and feel comfortable in picking up the phone and sharing your thoughts and your ideas or concerns with our other listeners here. We have a phone line that is specifically for that purpose. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd feel more comfortable just sharing your thoughts directly with me one-on-one in an email, I'd be honored to receive it. And I would like to do the best I can to represent you in sharing your ideas with other listeners. If you feel more comfortable doing it that way, that's fine with me. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906. That's all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And finally, I do want to remind you once again of our Facebook page. For those of you who are regular users of Facebook, you know how simple it is. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, there's a search box at the top. And if you type the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution in that search box, you will be on our Facebook page. And this weekend, in fact, last evening, I posted an item on Facebook, and it's one of the things I'd like to address early on in our program today. It referred specifically, it was a link to an article in yesterday's New York Times by Maureen Dowd that I thought was pretty special. And I felt that it was well worth a read for many of the folks who listen regularly to the Virtual Center. So that's why I put it on the page. I was kind of flattered a little bit this morning when I tuned in early this morning to MSNBC, to the Morning Joe program, which I know a lot of people, especially people in government, regularly watch it. And they featured the same article in their discussions as well. So I guess my sense when I first read it was that it's one of those that it seems to me people ought to be aware of, ought to be at least familiar with. Because I think it's pretty perceptive, and I think it's pretty real, and it deals pretty much with the impending inauguration of our new president on the 20th day of January, which is 11 days from now. And so anyway, I want to begin with that particular piece. But just a comment or two. We're looking at what I think is a very, very interesting week in terms of national politics this week, because this week, many of the nominees that Donald Trump has made for key offices and posts in his cabinet are scheduled to appear before Senate committees for confirmation. And the fact of the matter is, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but I just wanted to make mention of it. Many of these folks have not completed the paperwork necessary to hold these hearings. There is a particular form that nominees are required to fill out and submit prior to their nomination hearing. I believe I read it in one place. I believe it's Form 278. I believe that's right. And in it, you basically list all your affiliations and a little bit about your background and anything else. And of course, what those who will ultimately confirm you are looking for are potential conflicts of interest or potential problems. And the idea is to catch these things early in order to prevent something bad happening down the road. Well, the fact of the matter is many of the people that Donald Trump has nominated for office have not finished the paperwork. Part of it, it seems to me, deals with the personalities of the people themselves. But there's an added factor, and that is that this particular set of appointments is probably consists of some of the most influential, connected people financially in the nation's history. And so many of them have memberships on foundations and boards and as well as stocks and trusts and bonds and various other things in so many different financial organizations and operations, not only in this country but around the world, that the potential for conflicts of interest is probably greater with this set of appointments than it's been with any previous administration. And the fact of the matter is the leaders of the Republican Party who scheduled the confirmation hearings for many of these nominees are determined to push forward and go on. And it has raised some serious questions. Many Democrats who are in the minority, of course, and again, we've got to realize the political nature of this as well. But the fact of the matter is many people, not just Democrats, Republicans as well, are concerned because there's always a danger that something's going to slip through or something is not going to be caught during the confirmation hearings that will come up later. And then they'll be blamed for not catching it at the front end rather than the nominee himself or herself. There's another factor, and I haven't seen a whole lot of people focus on this one, but I think it's incredibly important. It's not only that a number of these hearings are scheduled this week, but it's coupled with the fact that many of them are scheduled at the same time. From what I recall, there are a couple of hearings, nominee hearings tomorrow scheduled, but then on Wednesday there are 5 different confirmation hearings scheduled. And among them, and I can't remember the specifics of all of them, but among the 5 on Wednesday are Rex Tillerson, who's the appointee or the nominee for Secretary of State, and Betsy DeVos, who is the nominee for Education. Both of those people, of course, Rex Tillerson is the president of ExxonMobil, and Betsy DeVos is the heir of the Amway fortune, and obviously most of these people are heavily involved and heavily invested in a number of different ventures. The logistics of trying to conduct confirmations hearings on so many people, so many involved people, at the same time is incredible. There's absolutely no question that what it's going to do is make it difficult to focus on any one or two particular hearings. And that that seems to be part of a political strategy. And so the fact that this is compounded by the fact that many of these folks haven't completed all the requisite paperwork basically means that there are serious questions about this confirmation process from beginning to end. And I think it's important to be aware of that. It's going to be very difficult, not only for those sitting on confirmation committees who are going to have to at some point vote on these nominees, but the media as well, and the media's ability to cover these hearings. Obviously, they're going to focus on Tillerson and probably Betsy DeVos. I think another one on Wednesday is the I can't remember his name right now. The one that was nominated, fellow that was nominated for Secretary of Commerce. Anyway, there are a number of issues here in this whole confirmation process. And I listened yesterday intently to Mitch McConnell's rationalization for maintaining this schedule. And he makes the point that 8 years ago, when Barack Obama was elected president in the election of 2008, the Senate conducted a number of simultaneous hearings at that time as well. And the rationale was that on the day he took office, the president wanted his cabinet and his appointees approved and ready to go. And Mitch McConnell's argument is that's essentially what we're trying to do this time around. So his feeling is that, at that time in 2008, the Republicans were the minority in the Senate. And many of them had problems, he pointed out, with nominees that Barack Obama had made for cabinet posts and other administrative positions, just as many Democrats have problems with those that Donald Trump has nominated this time around. Mitch McConnell's advice or recommendation, he said, basically, we had to live with it. We had to get over it. And so do the Democrats this time. They're just going to have to realize that there's a new president coming into office, and this president has the right to have his administration in place when he's ready to go. There's one difference between the two situations from 8 years ago and today, and that difference is the paperwork. Many people point out that you can't conduct the hearings if you don't have the data, if you don't have the information. And so therefore, by definition, not having the information on many of these people is going to create confirmation problems, nomination problems. And of course, some of the paperwork, for example, with Tillerson, would be quite involved and quite heavy. I was reading just the other day a report that in divesting himself, in leaving his position as president of ExxonMobil in order to assume the Secretary of State's position, Tillerson became eligible for an annual pension of $180 million a year. I ask you to think about that. $180 million a year pension. Wow. So that's the kind of thing that seems to me that the Senate is going to have to wrestle with as they conduct or try to conduct these nominations. That's one of the things that's happening this week. I think it's going to get a lot of attention. I also think we need to, I guess I need to make reference to the fact, of course, if any of you happened to see the Golden Globe Awards last evening or caught the reports this morning about them, you probably know that a number of comments were made during the Golden Globe Awards last night, referencing Donald Trump and his impending presidency. And one of the most meaningful, it seems to me, presentations was delivered by Meryl Streep. And she basically made it pretty clear that she was very disturbed. And of course, as to be expected, as we've learned to expect, Donald Trump tweeted this morning and basically made very disparaging comments about Meryl Streep as being a second-grade actress and these kinds of things, when in fact most people appreciate the fact that she's one of the best actresses that we've ever seen. But and again, I think one of the things that, and we were chatting, Agnes and I were chatting before we went on the air today about this. I do believe that it's becoming pretty clear that one major mistake that Democrats made in the campaign was to focus too much on the personality and the behavior of Donald Trump himself, and not focusing on his policies and his positions on issues. I really believe that was a mistake. Because given the enthusiasm of those who are the most ardent supporters of this particular candidate, when you attack that candidate directly, these people obviously have a tendency to dig in their heels. The result is they listen to less. They're refusing to accept criticism generally, and they become more firm, more embedded, if you will, in their determination to see that this person is elected than anything else. I think in a lot of ways, I really believe that strategy, political strategy, probably backfired. But that's just my observation. But I do believe it's a significant one. This is a Monday, and on Monday we frequently kind of have a hit and miss, a little bit of this, a little bit of that kind of a program. I want to deal with that at least at the beginning of the program today. But in our second hour, and I hope not too long into our second hour, I want to get into a letter from Thomas Jefferson here at the Virtual Center. I think that this particular letter is going to be one of those that's going to take a few days to really do justice to. And it is, I think, one of the most significant letters that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote. I think, in fact, and that's one of the things I'm going to emphasize when we do cover this, it may be one of the most important letters that any of the founders have left us. And let me just say, as an introduction to it, that in this letter, Jefferson goes into great detail on the substance of Republican government. More detail than he or many of the others have ever gone into. And in the course of this, we'll see this particular thing, but I just want to make this point because when we get into the letter and come across it again, I want it to kind of ring a bell with those of you listening. Jefferson makes the point that at the time of independence, at the time when these Republican governments were being created in our states, as state constitutions were being written in 1776, it was really difficult to pin down exactly what people meant by Republican government. They tended to mean different things. We have, in the past, here at the Virtual Center, we've looked at a couple of the Federalist Papers in order to nail down Madison's view of Republican government as well as Hamilton's. We haven't looked at Jefferson's that much Because honestly, during the Constitutional Convention, as we know, Jefferson wasn't even in the country. But he was in constant communication with Madison, especially Madison and George Washington. And many of his letters contained a lot of recommendations. But none of them go into the kind of detail that he goes into in this letter. And one of the points he makes in that letter, which I think is just incredibly important, he says that it's really difficult to nail down or get your arms around what people meant by Republican government, because many people meant so didn't, assume so many different things about it. And Jefferson's conclusion in this letter is that at that time, people's commitment to Republican government was so universal and so strong that even though they couldn't define it, it seemed to come down to the fact that every government that was not a monarchy, to many people, was a republic. And Jefferson's argument is that in the minds of many people, it came down to the fact that Republican government is any government that's not a monarchy. Because what people believed Republican government should have, must have, and would not be Republican government without it is, changes and is so vague in the minds of many people. We will remember, I believe, and I think this is Federalist number 55, but I'm not really sure. In one of the Federalist papers, Madison makes the point that republicanism, Republican government, is what he calls the genius of the American people. And however you structure the Constitution, however you organize the frame of government, the fact of the matter is, if it's not Republican, it's not going to fly. And if you recall, Madison says not only is it not going to fly, Madison says it shouldn't fly. That after an analysis of the Constitution as presented for ratification to the states, if the case is successfully made that the Constitution violates the principles of republicanism, then Madison said the Constitution should not, ought not, to be ratified. That, it seems to me, is an incredible statement, given the fact that for all practical purposes, Madison wrote the initial draft of the Constitution of the United States, which was the submission of his Federalist, of his Virginia plan. So for him to go to the trouble of submitting the draft of a plan as a prospective constitution for this nation, and then stating after the Constitution is created that if you can prove to me that this government is not Republican, then I will agree with you that it ought not to be ratified. I think that's a pretty positive and sound statement as to how committed the American people were to the principles of republicanism. And Jefferson reinforces this. The interesting thing about this letter, and I'll just say one more thing about it, and then I want to get into a couple of other things before we get to that letter. Jefferson's letter is written in 1816. The date on it is July 12th, 1816. Madison has left the presidency for 4 years. If you recall, in 1808, Madison's been out of the presidency for 8 years. In 1808, Madison is elected president. He's president for 2 terms until the election of 1816 when James Monroe is elected. So Jefferson is out of the presidency. He's been out of the presidency for almost a decade when he writes this statement. The reason I say that is because Jefferson's comments about republicanism are made later in his life. 1816 is just about a decade, 10 years before Jefferson dies. As you know, Jefferson and John Adams both die on the same day, July 4th, 1826. So 1816 is 10 years before Jefferson is to pass. The point I'm making is Jefferson's views on republicanism are not the views of one in the heat of political battle trying to get a particular agenda through a hostile Congress or a hostile legislature. Jefferson has reached the stage of being one of the nation's most prominent sages. And so what he feels at this point in his life about republicanism is just that. It's what he feels. It's what his wisdom and his experience and his education have led him to believe in. So I think this particular letter is extremely important. And I wanted to take the time to introduce this letter and get into it here at the Virtual Center. We hopefully will be into it in our second hour today, but my guess is that we won't finish it. It'll continue to be with us tomorrow, I'm sure. I mentioned early on today that one of the postings that I put on our Facebook page last evening was a link to an article in yesterday's New York Times by Maureen Dowd. And she obviously is writing about the coming inauguration of President Trump, President-elect Trump. But more importantly, what she's talking about in this article is the mood of the country as this inauguration approaches. More specifically, the mood in and around Washington. And her sense is that the mood in Washington, as we get closer and closer to the Trump inauguration, is one that is incredibly interesting and revealing. In a sense, and I'm not paraphrasing the letter or anything else now. This is just my sense from having read the letter yesterday. Maureen Dowd believes that there's a sense of fear and anxiety that is pervasive in and around Washington. Many people who have spent their lives in government are really nervous about this one. They really don't know what to expect. They don't know what to wish for. Many of them wish, obviously, that the election had gone differently. Many of them, accepting the results of the election, hope or wish that the president-elect will really begin to become more presidential once he's inaugurated than he's been prior to his inauguration, prior to the election, and since the election. Many people hope that the office will make the man. That once President Trump begins to appreciate fully the awesome responsibility of the office, his inner talents and skills will take over, and he'll be able to step up to the challenges and perform them admirably. And many of these people point to past elections where people who came into the presidency that didn't seem to be qualified for the office tended to become very successful presidents. And thus the statement that sometimes the office makes the man. Many people hope for that. But the problem is that many people are afraid that the candidate that we've seen throughout late 2015 and throughout the year of 2016 and into 17 will not change. And that the same person who comes into office on the 20th will be the person who ran for it in 2016. And that they really worry about. They're concerned about the tweets. They're concerned about the peak that Donald Trump tends to show, how easy it is for people to get under his skin, how very personal his responses are. One of the things I put on the Facebook piece that I put in there yesterday about this Maureen Dowd article was some of the examples of things he's done and said throughout the campaign that raise serious questions. Meryl Streep referred last night specifically to his mimicking or ridiculing the handicapped reporter for the New York Times, if you remember that. That was the focus of her commentary. Just last week, when Congress came back to Washington, the Democrats met and elected Charles Schumer, senator from New York, as minority leader in the Senate. And Charles Schumer has appeared on a number of programs since then talking about what the Democratic Party strategy will be, what his strategy will be in the Senate in order to try to slow down, because they don't have the power to block, but slow down much of the announced Trump agenda. And in response to that, Donald Trump referred to Charles Schumer as a clown. I mean, he's done this with people who have irritated him numerous times in the past, so nobody should be surprised by it. But the fact of the matter is, the head of the other party that you'll be dealing with, when you call him a clown, it doesn't seem to bode well for good working relationships, if that makes sense. And this is the kind of thing we're talking about. A lot of people hope that that will change once the president-elect becomes president. Some people worry that it can't change and won't change. And therefore they worry about the future of the country and what's going to happen to us and all these other things. But the fact of the matter is, this is around Washington. And the maps, the election maps, election result maps of the nation that have come out since the election on November 8th have made it very clear that the nation is pretty well divided. Hillary won both coasts, the East Coast and the West Coast, but the middle part of the country is predominantly red. And so basically, one of the articles we mentioned, I think maybe a week ago, we looked at an article about the difference between urban America and rural America. And the fact of the matter is, rural America elected Donald Trump. And so the question is, what can you say or what conclusions can you draw about the mentality and the perspective and the depth of understanding in rural America? Can we afford to conclude that the people who voted for Donald Trump had no idea what they were doing? If, you know, or on the other hand, is it better to spend time trying to figure out what it is they thought they were doing and see if somehow between now and the next election, people who don't like the current administration can address some of those problems and do something about the result? Anyway, that's the issue that I dealt with in the link. I really believe that this article is important because it raises questions. And I took an excerpt from it just one sentence from the article to kind of provide a flavor for some of the things that Maureen Dowd was saying and some of the things that she was concluding. As far as Washington is concerned, she says the following, quote, "The city, Washington, has the panicked air of a B horror movie where the townsfolk stand stock still, bug-eyed and frozen, too frightened to flee, waiting for the creature," unquote. And think of the old black and white grade B movies, monster movies. And everybody knows it's out there, but they don't know where it came from. They don't know what it looks like. They're petrified. They're holding their breath or whatever. And Maureen Dowd makes the point and said in Washington, it's very, very much like the Cold War. In the Cold War, the mentality of the period in this country, to a large extent, was what she calls duck and cover. Many of you who lived through that period will know exactly what she's talking about. I know I do. Our schools, when I was in public school during this period of the Cold War, and I can remember we used to have drills on getting under our desks and covering our ears for a nuclear, in order to prepare for a nuclear explosion. When in fact, we know realistically that that wasn't going to do any good. But on the other hand, we were doing something. We were doing all we could do. And the only way to continue to promote it was to suggest that it would work. But the fact of the matter is, we know that it would not. Basically, she says that the town, Washington, is in a sort of duck and cover mode, reminiscent of the Cold War days. Only this time, and this is my point, the difference is that this time, the threat, the monster, so to speak, that causes them to hide, to duck and cover, is one that tens of millions of Americans voted into office. And many people are anticipating a very rocky 4 years. In fact, I've heard people who know, people who are fairly well informed, make the prediction that President Trump will likely be impeached because he's walking on the very edge of so many issues. All I can think back to is early in the campaign when candidate Trump made the statement that if he shot somebody in Times Square, it would be hard to get a jury together that would convict him. So popular was he. What that says to me is that he feels comfortable bending the rules, walking on the edge, violating issues or policies or traditions here and there. He really believes, in a sense, that he's made of Teflon. Everybody used to refer to Ronald Reagan as the Teflon president. But when you take the idea of Teflon and apply it, it probably applies much more directly and much more fruitfully to Donald Trump, even than it did Ronald Reagan. The point I make is that many people are looking at the administration coming into office with trepidation. Some people believe that it's going to be a joke, that everything we've believed in, the rules, the traditions, the values, the Constitution that we've lived under and respected for so long, is going to be trampled piecemeal as one after the other policies, provisions, and traditions are violated. We don't have any, I was going to say we just have the feeling. The fact is we don't have any indication as yet to suggest that this won't work. And that is that this man seems to believe that nothing he does carries with it any serious responsibility. That in effect he can get away with anything. So some people believe that this administration looks like it's going to be a farce, a joke. Others believe that it's going to be a tragedy. I don't use those two words lightly, because those are the same words that James Madison used when he talked about the significance of an informed electorate. Jefferson believed that political knowledge is critical if Republican government is to work. People need to be informed. They need to know. And Madison predicted that the greatest threat to Republican government is not giving people access to the information they need in order to guide government on the right track. Madison himself, in a letter he wrote in 1822, warned what can happen to popular government if people are kept ignorant, if they are denied access to the kinds of critical information they need to make self-government work. The outcome, the result, Madison predicted, and this is a quote from that letter, is but prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. In other words, Madison addressed this very kind of mood, this very kind of situation. And he points out that in reality, there's not that much difference between farce and tragedy when it comes to Republican government, to the principles of Republican government. The reason I posted this link to Maureen Dowd's article, and the reason I wanted to devote time to it today on the Virtual Center, is because I wanted to make the connection between Madison's prediction that denying information to people in a republic will produce a situation that will either be a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. The fact of the matter is, the situation we're in today is different than that. Madison never envisioned a situation where people had access to the information they needed and didn't want it. Never envisioned a situation where people would defend ignorance, where people would not want to be bothered with the truth, with data, with the facts. The fact of the matter is, we are facing a situation right now, a cultural phenomenon in this country, and that's what I think Maureen Dowd has tapped into in this article, which is the reason that I recommended it. We seem to be experiencing a cultural phenomenon in this country, where people are defending ignorance. People are questioning truth. People are questioning whether, in fact, there's even such a thing as truth. People are beginning to argue and believe that my truth is as good as your truth. My opinion is as valid as your opinion, whether it's based on fact or not. We see this in terms of climate. in terms of those who deny the realities of climate change, who deny the hard science, deny the data that supports the concerns about human causes of climate change. Basically, the argument that they subscribe to, many people, is that while a lot of people accept this data and a lot of people accept the realities of climate change and the role that human beings are playing in it, the fact of the matter is I don't. And that's okay. I just don't want to know about that data. I just choose not to believe it. For me, I'm much more comfortable believing that this warming of the climate, kind of difficult to say this today with a blanket of snow on the ground and temperatures in the single numbers, but that this warming of the climate is part of a natural phenomenon that happens periodically throughout history. And that as best we can, we're just going to have to live with it. Some people even believe that it's arrogant to believe that human beings could affect climate. Climate is one of those things that's associated with the creation of the universe. And that, in turn, is associated with the Creator. And for human beings to believe that they have the power to negatively affect creation itself is arrogant, they believe. The fact of the matter is, many people believe that the reason they can be comfortable with the onset of the new administration is because this president-elect promises a degree of change which is more and greater, more profound than any we've ever seen before. And those people who reached a level of anger and frustration about the existing situation wanted to defeat the establishment. They saw Hillary Clinton as the establishment. They saw Donald Trump, or they see Donald Trump, as a challenge to that establishment. With that kind of change pending, then all the other things about his character and his personality and his habits and his temperament and all these other things, many of these folks could care less about. So some of the issues that I've raised, and I only raised a few, his tax returns, the idea of conflict of interest, a cabinet staffed almost completely by millionaires, the introduction of nepotism into key staff appointments. We're talking here, of course, about his daughter and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And you may have picked up today, earlier, that attorneys are now saying that it's not a violation, it's not conflict of interest for Jared Kushner, even though he's the son-in-law of the president, will be the son-in-law of the President of the United States, to hold a high-level staff advisory position in the White House. So consequently, he'll have an office in the White House, and so will his wife, Ivanka. Climate change denial. Calling Chuck Schumer a clown. Promising waterboarding and things much worse in order to deal with international terrorism. And the list goes on and on and on. Issues that would derail most administrations don't seem to have much of an impact on this one. The answer, then, one has to wonder whether duck and cover can even work this time. It really couldn't work before, but we continued to believe that we were doing all we could. The more we reflect on the nature of the republic that the founders gave us, the republic that Ben Franklin in mid-September 1787 reportedly told a passerby in Philadelphia when the Constitutional Convention adjourned. When asked what kind of a government we had, Franklin's response reputedly was, "A republic if you can keep it." The fact of the matter is, Madison in 1822 addressed a threat to the republic, namely a citizenry that was ill-informed, which would cause us to lose the republic that the founders gave us. Madison believed that an informed electorate would keep the ship of state afloat. Little did he know that we were going to come to a situation in this country where people would begin to challenge evidence, where people would begin to question the results and the assumptions which drove the scientific revolution and the so-called Enlightenment. The basis of the scientific revolution is the procedure for validating evidence. In today's world, we've reached a point where many people are comfortable rejecting that whole process. And what they're saying is, my opinion's as good as your opinion. The fact of the matter is, it's not. The fact of the matter is, those opinions that are driven or based upon research, hard evidence, insight, the results of competing opinions, the ability to withstand legitimate challenge, those definitions of truth which meet those standards are indeed far superior to the opinions of the uneducated or the uninformed. I don't care how strongly you are inclined, or anyone is inclined, to go with their gut, to go with their feeling. I'm extremely excited about Thomas Jefferson's belief that oftentimes the uneducated comes closer to the truth than the educated, because along with education comes the ability to manipulate evidence, comes the ability to confuse ends and means, to confuse outcomes, and to lose one's focus. Despite that, and despite my inclination to respect the value of conscience, the value of what Madison and Jefferson both referred to as the moral sense, the fact of the matter is, to reject hard evidence, to reject research and data, is to challenge the way that the educated Western world has chosen to define truth and to pursue truth for the last 500 years. I don't think we're dealing with the kinds of abilities that warrant rejecting that kind of evidence. So yes, I'm particularly concerned about it. I think this is an incredibly important issue. There's one additional issue that I'd like to deal with before we take our break at the top of the hour. We've got about 6 minutes before we take our break at the top of the hour, and I'd like to address another issue which I think is significant. I think it's one that's rather unrelated to the issue we've just dealt with. But on the other hand, I think it's significant. And it deals with the issue of religion. More specifically, it deals with research on the issue of religion. This past weekend, in the West Virginia Gazette, the Charleston Gazette, published here in Charleston, West Virginia, it is the state newspaper here in West Virginia, there were a couple of op-eds in the Sunday paper yesterday, both of them dealing with research in religion. The one I'd like to address is an article by David Haskell. David Haskell is a professor of religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. And that's where he did his research. But basically, I'd like to share with you the basis, the results of some of that research. What he found basically was that in today's world, liberal churches are dying while conservative churches are flourishing. He points to a report in 2015 by the Pew Research Center, which found that the religious congregations that are growing are the more conservative congregations manned by the most conservative clergy. Whereas the churches that are losing membership are the mainline religions, the mainline Christian religions, especially in Protestantism, Methodists, Evangelical Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Episcopalians. These mainline churches, which have traditionally focused on liberal issues, tend to be losing memberships at an incredibly disturbing rate. Around 1 million members a year. Haskell points out that 20 years ago, and I don't know how many people might remember this, I do, an Episcopal bishop, the U.S. Bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, John Shelby Spong, published a book 20 years ago entitled Why Christianity Must Change or Die. And in that book, Spong argued that congregations would grow if they abandoned their literal interpretations of the Bible and transformed instead to become more consistent with the changing times, more modern. Spong's general thesis became very popular with mainline Protestants. At the Harvard Divinity School, for example, Karen King, who's a member of the faculty there, basically praised Spong's book and said it should be required reading for everyone concerned with facing head-on the intellectual and spiritual challenges of late 20th century religious life in America. Harvard Divinity professor Harvey Cox, about Spong's book, said, Bishop Spong's work is a significant accomplishment. The fact of the matter is, many of these mainline churches did go along with Spong's recommendations. And in today's world, 2015, according to the Pew Research Center, they are losing membership rapidly. Some of the results of Haskell's research in Ontario. He basically addressed 22 mainline congregations in Ontario who totaled 2,200 members of congregations. 93% of the clergy members, 83% of the worshipers in his research agreed with the statement, quote, Jesus rose from the dead with a real flesh and blood body, leaving behind an empty tomb. Basically, then, what Haskell's research shows is that the churches that are gaining membership are the churches, the fundamentalist, more fundamental churches, who tend to go back to the literal reading of the Bible. Again, 93% of the clergy, 83% of the membership from growing churches agreed with the statement that Jesus arose from the dead with a real flesh and blood body, leaving behind an empty tomb. Also, the statement that God performs miracles in answers to people's prayers. On the other hand, the churches that question these literal readings of Scripture are losing members and losing members rapidly. Basically, then, what Haskell's research shows is that while mainline churches followed Bishop Spong's recommendations from 20 years ago, the fact of the matter is they ended up going in the wrong direction if attracting new members is their number one priority. I want to contrast this with another article that appeared in the same newspaper yesterday, the Charleston Gazette. And this particular article is by Francis Wilkinson. Wilkinson. And let me share with you who Wilkinson is. He writes editorials on politics and domestic policy for Bloomberg. He was executive editor of The Week and previously a national affairs writer for Rolling Stone and a communications consultant, political media strategist. He's writing about the same thing. The only difference is Wilkinson's approach is to look at the results of this data in the context of the administration of Donald Trump, which will be coming into office in 11 days. That's what I'd like to address when we come back after our break. We're at 3 minutes after the hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with you. And I know that Agnes has some very, very, I was going to say peaceful, charming music, but I don't know whether that's true or not. So, but there will be some music during the interlude. So I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Monday, it is the 9th day of January in the year 2017. Let me get stuck there on the year for a moment. Let me share with you some of the housekeeping specifics that we try to do each day here at the Virtual Center. The first is our phone number. We do invite you to call. We'd love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with us that way, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. And again, I do remind you of our Facebook page and the link that we talked about in our first hour, the Maureen Dowd article and the comments that I made about it, is available on our Facebook page. If you go to the home page and in the search box type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will see that the very latest posting on that Facebook page is this particular link referring to the article by Maureen Dowd, and I do recommend it to you. For those of you just joining us, welcome. We did, as I mentioned, we looked at Maureen Dowd's article in yesterday's New York Times in our first hour, and we spent the bulk of the hour talking about the mood that Maureen Dowd comments upon in and around Washington, D.C. as the inauguration of Donald Trump comes closer and closer. And she equates it to the duck and cover mode or mentality of the Cold War. There's a tremendous fear and a tremendous sense of anxiety. And yes, probably some frustration even at this early point about this new administration. We talked quite a bit about that in our first hour. And then we started to talk about a couple of articles that appeared this past weekend in the Charleston Gazette in Charleston, West Virginia. If you want to find these articles, you can go to the opinion page on wvgazette.com. wvgazette.com. Just click on opinion, and then you scroll down and you will see by date today's articles coming first and then yesterday's. And in yesterday's, you will find two articles dealing with the latest research on religion, in not only in this nation, but in one of the articles deals with research done in Ontario. It is the article by I want to make sure I don't mess up the man's name, David Haskell, and we talked about that just before we took our break. And Haskell points out that the churches in America, or in Ontario, but he's obviously assuming the same results apply to America. The churches that are growing are the more conservative churches, the ones directed or inclined to take Scripture much more directly, much more fundamentally. Whereas liberal churches, the mainline churches, Episcopals, Presbyterians, Methodists, etc., are losing membership at an incredible rate, on average 1 million a year. Wilkinson's article, which is the one that we're going to be opening the second hour with, Wilkinson's article is about the same topic. The difference is he's looking at religion through the perspective of the political change about to happen in this country with the ascendancy of the Trump administration in the United States. His belief or his suggestion is that many of the major differences between conservative clergy and liberal clergy, between conservative congregations and liberal congregations, are going to be played out in the context of politics. That increasingly those who are most disturbed with the coming administration of Donald Trump, and especially many of the more questionable policies and programs that Trump has talked about through the campaign, abolishing the Affordable Care Act, limiting immigration, boycotting and making it much more difficult for Muslims to enter this country. Many of the other things that have disturbed a lot of people, many of these are causing people to move into the mainline churches. Whereas the more conservative approaches, those are the people that elected Donald Trump, tend to be moving in that direction. So in a sense, what we're beginning to see, Wilkinson says, is the playing out of the political realities that are currently happening within the competition between different forms of religion. One of the things that I think we need to recognize or ask ourselves is why the conservative churches tend to be growing enrollment, whereas liberal churches tend to be losing it. Especially in an environment where research in other areas tells us that more and more Americans are ceasing to belong to anything, that those who identify as members of a particular religious group are declining rapidly. More and more young people especially seem to be reluctant to become affiliated with any particular religious group. Yet the fact of the matter is, conservative, more fundamental churches are gaining membership, whereas the mainline churches are losing it. I think it's important to ask why. And I think the most obvious answer is the idea of strength of belief. It's pretty obvious that those who are inclined to take Scripture literally are much more serious about their religion. The strength of their beliefs, their religious beliefs, tend to outweigh those of the more liberal mainline churches. The other thing that I think is significant, and this is Wilkinson's point, is that these mainline liberal churches, who are focusing more than anything else on concern for the poor and the idea of the social gospel, are obviously moving towards mainline churches which emphasize service to the poor. One of the groups, for example, that has formed recently is called Matthew 25. And of course, it relates to the 25th verse of Matthew, where Jesus called people to serve the least of these. And so this particular group, Matthew 25, focuses on the least of these: poor, immigrants, Muslims. These people are organizing in mainline churches under the banner of Jesus, Wilkinson argues. So I think that's quite significant. So in a sense then, what we're seeing is those people who moved in the direction of Donald Trump and his policies are the same people that in religion are moving toward more conservative fundamentalist Christian denominations, whereas mainline, more liberal churches are moving in the opposite direction. It appears then, to me, that David Haskell's research that the mainline churches are losing membership rapidly may change with the ascendancy of the Trump administration. More and more liberal religious organizations like Sojourners, Matthew 25, and some of the others are moving and beginning to emphasize their focus on the poor, on immigrants, on the downtrodden, the people that are most concerned with the policies and programs of the Trump administration. And so, in a sense, Wilkinson seems almost to predict that the decline of membership in liberal churches is indeed liable to increase with the Trump administration. He refers to it as a Trump bump, which is a cute play on words, it seems to me. My point is, these two articles are significant because they are contemporary. They are based on the latest research, and they kind of tell us how some of the political realities and political trends we're seeing, trends and issues that we talk about here at the Virtual Center all the time, are being reflected or are playing out in religion as well. And I think it's very significant. However, the one thing that I would point out, and this I think is a negative, is that what we're seeing is the same splits in our social fabric that are dividing the nation are also reflected in our religion and our religious affiliations as well. It would seem to me that traditionally religion has been a way to bring disparate groups together. But what we're experiencing today, even in religion, is that religious affiliation itself is contributing to our divisions, to our social divisions. And I see that as a problem. Because what we're seeing is two approaches to religion competing with each other for membership. But the fact of the matter is, it would seem to me that somehow, if religion is going to fulfill its mission in a society like ours, it would need to find a way to close the gap between these disparate groups and find ways to bring us together. Answer or suggestion that religion could perform some of the more positive things that our politics seems to be doing to our society that is negative. Anyway, those two issues, the issue of contemporary religion and how the political realities of this world are affecting it, and also the mood, if you will, about the oncoming ascendancy of the Trump administration, are two issues that I did want to open today's program with. But as I mentioned, the issue that I'd like to address for the rest of our time today, and likely well beyond today, is this 1816 letter of Thomas Jefferson on the intricacies and the ingredients of Republican government. I mentioned at the beginning of our program today that Jefferson himself makes the point in this letter. He says, "In truth, the abuses of monarchy had so much filled all the space of political contemplation that we imagined everything Republican which was not monarchy." What Jefferson is suggesting is that people's understanding of the specifics of Republican government are so vague, so hard to pin down precisely, that it almost seemed at the time of independence, around 1776, that people were concluding that what the revolution was about more than anything was coming up with an alternative to monarchy. And they called that alternative republicanism. And Jefferson is saying maybe it seems like people tended to believe that the specifics of Republican government weren't nearly as important as was the fact that it was an alternative to monarchy, that it was not a monarchy. I think that's very significant. But I'd like to open this discussion with a perspective or an issue that it's been some time since we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center. And that is the whole idea of the substance of Republican government. Before we look at Jefferson's letter and the details, the specifics of that letter, I'd like to basically put the letter into context by suggesting how significant it is. I believe that we will see that Jefferson has contributed a great deal to our overall understanding of republicanism. He's going to give us specifics of how you set up your system, how you organize your government in order to fulfill the principles of Republican government. And his faith in republicanism is so strong that Jefferson believes that in spite of the fact many people believe that these kinds of changes or improvements will be difficult, Jefferson's feeling is if you let the principles guide you, the details, the nuts and bolts, becomes much easier. And Jefferson is convinced that many of our governments violate the principles of republicanism on which they claim to be founded. It's that reality that we've made so many mistakes in our governments, Jefferson believed, that it's important that we lay out the details of exactly what Republican principle demands and how best to implement it. I think that this is one of the most important letters in early American history. And let me explain why. Several months ago, probably a couple of years ago, actually, we dealt here at the Virtual Center with a Supreme Court case that was decided in 1849. Now, of course, we need to realize 1849 is 11 years before the election of Abraham Lincoln, and the nation is being torn apart by differences over slavery and the threat of Southern secession from the Union. And we know that in 1857, the Supreme Court is going to do itself damage by its decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. But in 1849, the case came before the Supreme Court, which has gone down as Luther versus Borden. The name of this case, Luther versus Borden, 1849. In this case, the Supreme Court took on the question of Republican government based on Article 4 of the Constitution. If you look at Article 4 of the Constitution, that particular article commits the government under the Constitution to guarantee Republican government throughout the country. That's pretty specific. That one of the responsibilities of the new federal government under the Constitution is to guarantee states Republican governments. So naturally, the question that the Supreme Court has to deal with is what exactly does a commitment to Republican government mean? What are the ingredients of a Republican government? This case comes up in 1849. It's a case that emerged in the state of Rhode Island. And it was tied in to an event in Rhode Island history called the Dorr Rebellion, D-O-R-R. The Dorr Rebellion was an effort to overthrow the charter government of Rhode Island. The charter government of Rhode Island, like other charter governments during the colonial period, was a government set up in accordance with the charter issued by the King of England. And in Rhode Island, even though Rhode Island is one of the 13 colonies, was committed to the principles of republicanism, the fact of the matter is those in Rhode Island who held power at the time of the American Revolution were reluctant to give it up. Consequently, the government of Rhode Island was fighting, objecting to efforts to increase the size of the electorate in accordance with the principles of republicanism. Translation: the power structure in Rhode Island was unwilling to give up any of its power to the emerging election of a Republican government, which allowed more citizens to vote. The Dorr Rebellion was the effort of these Republican advocates to overthrow the charter government of Rhode Island. The leader of the Dorr Rebellion was arrested. And the case came before the Supreme Court based on Article 4 of the Constitution. And that reads specifically, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, unquote. The leader of the Dorr Rebellion argued that the Supreme Court should find that the charter government acted illegally under the Constitution of the United States, Article 4. That for the charter government to refuse to implement some of the Republican changes in government in that state violated Article 4 of the Constitution. In addition to that, the case was based on the fact that the court would find for the new Republican government that wanted to take over in Rhode Island. In other words, the Supreme Court was asked to validate revolution under Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States, which guaranteed each state a Republican form of government. When that decision was rendered by the Supreme Court, the court basically dodged the real issue. The court's decision argued that this question of what constituted a Republican government is a political question, not a judicial one. Therefore, the ingredients of Republican government needed to be addressed and decided at the congressional and executive levels, at the level of the governor of Rhode Island and the legislature of Rhode Island, not the Supreme Court of the United States. Basically, what the court decided in Luther versus Borden was that Article 4 of the Constitution was non-justiciable. That means that it was not a legal decision, it was a political decision to be arrived at by the political branches of government. Later on, after the Revolution, of course, one of the so-called Civil War amendments was the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment was included the famous Equal Protection Clause, which guaranteed every citizen of the United States equal protection under the laws, guaranteed each citizen that its votes would be equal and that the country would operate on the principle of one man, one vote. And the case of Baker versus Carr basically raised that question in the state of Tennessee, where Tennessee's efforts to apportion legislative districts was challenged under the 14th Amendment. But the issue that I would like to raise is that when the question of what constitutes Republican government came before the Supreme Court of the United States in 1859, the court made the decision to not take on that issue. Instead, to argue that Article 4 of that particular section of Article 4 was not a judicial decision, it was a political one. And that the ingredients of Republican government required political decisions on the part of the governor and the legislatures of the different states. Basically, then, what the court is saying is that there really is no definitive answer as to what the basic principles of republicanism are or ought to be. I would suggest to you that if the court had chosen instead to rule on this issue, it could have gone to this letter of Thomas Jefferson in mid-year 1816 in order to answer that question. Because in that question, Jefferson lays out in detail what he believed the principles of Republican government are all about, and the very specific things that governments need to do in order to fulfill those principles. And if the court wanted to define republicanism in 1849, it could have gone to Jefferson's 1822 letter as a source. If Antonin Scalia had been on the Supreme Court in 1849, his commitment to the ideas of original intent would have led him directly to this Jefferson letter, I believe, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the meanings of republicanism are kind of mixed up, confused, not specific, and are rather vague. But on the other hand, this letter of Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Kercheval on July 12, 1816, I would suggest to you, resolves much of that controversy and puts a lot of flesh on the bones of republicanism, as it were. Jefferson's, I'm not reading the whole letter, but Jefferson says in this letter to Kercheval, he said, usually, at this point in my life, he said, I'm out of political life, I'm retired, and I usually don't answer questions about the kinds of things you're talking about. Basically, what Kercheval had raised was the issue of the equality of representation. The idea that in a Republican government, representation needed to be permanently equal. Everybody needed to be considered the same. That things like property and wealth and class and race and all these other things ought not to come into play. Jefferson says in this letter to Kercheval, at the birth of our republic, I committed my opinion to the world in the draft of a constitution annexed to the notes on Virginia. If you remember, Jefferson wrote his notes on the state of Virginia in the 1780s. And along with those notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson sketched out the outlines of a constitution, a Republican constitution, that he believed the newly independent state of Virginia should adopt. Jefferson points out, however, that republicanism was in trouble in the early years of the republic. He said the infancy of the subject at that moment and our inexperience of self-government occasioned gross departures in that draft from genuine Republican canons. In other words, we were new at the game. We really hadn't had time to develop all the specifics, all the nuances, if you will, of Republican government by that time. In fact, he says, and this is the line I quoted before, in truth, the abuses of monarchy had so much filled all the space of political contemplation that we imagined everything Republican which was not monarchy. In other words, we were so new at the game that we really couldn't define specifically what we meant by republicanism. All we knew was that it wasn't monarchy. And beyond that, we didn't know much more, Jefferson said. That's what he meant that's what he said when he wrote the Notes on the State of Virginia. We had not yet penetrated to the mother principle. And here's the mother principle of Republican government. Jefferson says that governments are Republican only in proportion as they embody the will of the people and execute it. Listen to that line. Governments are Republican only in proportion as they embody the will of the people and execute it. Jefferson is talking about more than commitment to principles. Jefferson is talking about filling in the gaps in order to enact these principles into law. Hence, Jefferson said, our first constitutions, and remember, this is just a fact of historical record, but let me stop here just to make the point. We know that when the Continental Congress approved independence, when they approved Richard Henry Lee's resolution on June 7th, 1776, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Once the Continental Congress passed that resolution, that meant that the Continental Congress had decided to go for independence. And what it had to do then was notify each of the 13 states that we are in a struggle with the mother country for the independence of the 13 colonies. Consistent with that, then, each state should set up its own Republican government. And state after state after state followed through by writing constitutions. Many of them contained bills of rights, some didn't. So when it came time for the ratification of the Constitution, those who felt that the Constitution should have a Bill of Rights, those who questioned that, and Madison was one, could point to state constitutions which were enacted between 1776 and 1780 that didn't have bills of rights in their state constitutions. So when Jefferson says our first constitutions, he means the constitutions that were drafted by the states after the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Hence, he says, our first constitutions had really no leading principles in them. We were too new, he says. We hadn't yet penetrated the mother principle that a government is Republican when it embraces the will of the people and executes that will. The will of the people needs to control the direction, needs to guide the direction of government. If it doesn't do that, It's not Republican, Jefferson is saying. But he goes on, experience and reflection have more and more confirmed me in the particular importance of the equal representation then proposed. So what he's basically saying is Samuel Kercheval's original question about Jefferson's feelings on the idea of equal representation, Jefferson is saying in response that he believes that equal representation is a critical ingredient of Republican government, and it ought to drive it. It's a principle that ought to drive the structure of government if it's to be Republican. And then Jefferson goes on. On that point, then, I'm entirely in sentiment with your letters, and only lament that a copy of your pamphlet prevents their appearance in the newspapers, where alone they would be generally read and produce general effect. Kercheval has published a pamphlet on the need for equal representation in government as being a critical ingredient of Republican government, and Jefferson is endorsing that in this letter. The present vacancy, too, of other matter would give them place in every paper and bring the question home to every man's conscience. Now we get into the substance of republicanism, according to Jefferson. He says, but inequality of representation in both houses of our legislature is not the only Republican heresy in this first essay of our revolutionary patriots at forming a constitution. Now he's going to go in and look at the structure of government as created in 1776, or as a result of the Declaration of 1776. And he's going to point out all the non-Republican elements within these constitutions as constructed. He says inequality of representation in both houses of our legislature isn't the only thing in the Constitution that's not Republican. For let it be agreed that a government is Republican in proportion as every member composing it has his equal voice in the direction of its concerns by representatives chosen by himself and responsible to him at short periods, and let us bring to the test of this canon every branch of our Constitution. Jefferson believes that equal representation is the critical ingredient to the implementation of Republican government. He said, let it be agreed that government is Republican in proportion as every member composing it has his equal voice in the direction of its concerns, of government's concerns. And then in parentheses, he says, not indeed in person, which would be impractical beyond the limits of a city or small township, but by representatives chosen by himself, responsible to him at short periods, which means representatives must stand for re-election often. In the Confederation period, under the Articles of Confederation, which is going to be created right after independence on the national level, members of Congress stood for re-election every year. Elections were annual. The thinking is that the only way to protect Republican government and protect people's right and ability to direct that government is to force representatives to stand before the people regularly in order to be judged. He says this principle then is the test. This canon is to be the test of every branch of our Constitution, not only our legislature, but up and down the line. The major elements of our Constitution needed to be based on this principle of the right of the will of the people to be reflected in the government that is created. The key principle of Republican government, Jefferson says, is the ability for the people to guide the republic and to do it in a way where everybody's voice is equal to everybody else's voice. Now Jefferson is going to go through the Virginia Constitution in detail, and he's going to point out where it violates this principle of Republican government. In the legislature, he says, the House of Representatives is chosen by less than half the people, and not at all in proportion to those who do choose. So the House of Representatives, which is the people's branch of government in the state of Virginia, is elected by less than half of the people. It violates the principles of Republican government. Then he goes to the Senate. And he said the Senate are still more disproportionate and for long terms of irresponsibility. So the House is bad, the Senate's worse. Then he goes to the executive, the governor. He says, in the executive, the governor is entirely independent of the choice of the people and of their control. His council equally so, and at best, but a fifth wheel to a wagon. What a way of criticizing a portion of government which is unnecessary or redundant. Jefferson's beauty with his flair for the language. Remember John Adams when he and Benjamin Franklin made the decision that Jefferson should write the Declaration of Independence. Adams made the comment to Jefferson that rumor has it that you have a masterful pen. You wield a masterful pen. And this is Jefferson's masterful pen. The governor's council, he says, is at best a fifth wheel to a wagon. In other words, totally unnecessary. So what he has said is, in the House of Representatives of Virginia, in the Senate of West Virginia, in the selection of the governor of West Virginia, and in the governor's council, we have violated, our Constitution violates the basic principles of Republican government up and down the line. But he's not done yet. In the judiciary, the judges of the highest courts are dependent on none but themselves. They're appointed for life. In England, he says, where judges were named and removable at the will of the hereditary executive, the monarch, from which branch most misrule was feared and has flowed, it was a great point gained by fixing them for life. In other words, in England, where the king controlled the courts, appointing the judges for life was a real positive. But here, in a Republican government, appointing them for life violates the principles of republicanism. Jefferson says, in a government founded on the public will, this principle operates in an opposite direction and against that will. There, too, they were still removable on a concurrence of the executive and legislative branches, but we have made them independent of the nation itself. They are irremovable, but by their own body, for any depravities of conduct, and even by their own body for the imbecilities of dotage. In other words, the fact that they lose their mind as they become too old. So that is the judges of the highest courts in Virginia. Now he goes to the justices of the lower courts. He said the justices of the inferior courts are self-chosen, are for life, and perpetuate their own bodies in succession forever, so that a faction once possessing themselves of the bench of a county can never be broken up, but hold their county in chains, forever indissoluble. These justices, he said, are really the executive as well as the judiciary in all of our minor and most ordinary concerns. These are the decisions that the courts in the counties make. They tax us at will, fill the office of the sheriff, the most important of all the executive officers of the county. Name nearly all our military leaders, which leaders once named are removable only by themselves. The juries, our judges of all fact and of law when they choose it, are not selected by the people either, nor amenable to them. They're chosen by an officer named by the court and the executive and the governor. Jefferson goes on, where then is our republicanism to be found? If you go through the Virginia Constitution, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the governor, the governor's council, the high courts, the inferior courts in the counties, the juries, up and down the line, republicanism is being violated in the Virginia Constitution created at the time of independence. So Jefferson's conclusion, his answer is, where then is our republicanism to be found? Not in our Constitution, certainly, but merely in the spirit of our people. They would oblige even a despot to govern us republicanly. Owing to this spirit and to nothing in the form of our constitutions, all things have gone well. In other words, the people, the will of the people, is the only place where republicanism lives, Jefferson said. When we wrote this Constitution, we violated the principles of republicanism up and down the line. The only thing left of republicanism is in the spirit of the people. Owing to this spirit, Jefferson says, and to nothing in the form of our constitutions, all things have gone well. In other words, we've done pretty good, considering we don't have a Republican Constitution at all. Things have gone pretty well. But this reality, this fact, triumphantly misquoted by the enemies of Reformation, is not because of our Constitution, but has prevailed in spite of it. We've done pretty well, he says, but not because our Constitution is Republican. The reason we've done pretty well is in spite of our Constitution, not because of it. Our functionaries have done well because they're generally honest men. If any were not so, they feared to show it. But it will be said, it's easier to find faults than amend them. And this is the point where principle needs to drive the process, Jefferson says. I don't think their amendment so difficult as is pretended. Only lay down the true principles and adhere to them inflexibly. Do not be frightened into their surrender by the alarms of the timid, or the croakings of wealth against the ascendancy of the people. If we really believe in the principles of Republican government, Jefferson says, then we need to amend our Constitution from top to bottom. We cannot allow the timidity of some of our people and what he calls the croakings of the wealthy to criticize the ascendancy of the people. If experience is called for, Jefferson says, appeal to that of our 15 or 20 governments for 40 years. Jefferson said, show me. Show me where the people have done half the mischief during these 40 years that a single despot would have done in 1 year. Show me half the riots and rebellions, crimes and punishments which have taken place in any nation under kingly government during that same period. In other words, for those of you who don't believe in the ability of the people, look at the evidence. Look at the fact. It's working. We need to make it work here. Only lay down the principles and adhere to them inflexibly, Jefferson said. With that, our time is up, but there's quite a bit more in this letter, and I want to get to it tomorrow, but again, we've run out of time today. It's a fantastic letter because it lays out the details of what government must be, how constitutions must be written in order for the principles of republicanism to be prevalent. With that, let me say good evening. Thank you for joining us here at the Virtual Center. I invite you back tomorrow, 1/2 hour later than today, of course, our regular Tuesday schedule. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.